Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 23rd episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I'm grateful that you're here. Before we get started, I'm going to ask something that I haven't asked in a while. Time is everyone's most precious commodity, and it's hard to get anyone's attention. If you are listening, then I'm grateful that you shared a little of each with me. Would you kindly share this podcast with any friends, family, or neighbors that you think might enjoy it? Post it to a social page, forward the link, anything really. Your help is so deeply appreciated. Thank you. Okay, with that out of the way. Last time, we concluded our multi-part episode on Wu the Great, the 7th emperor of the illustrious Han Dynasty. What a run he had. Both a wise and just leader and a ruthless tyrant, Wu of the Han, or Han Wudi, is an enigmatic figure that defies easy explanation. In this episode, we're going to meet another such character, a man who rose to power at a young age and lived a very full life of intrigue, bold moves, triumph, and tragedy. Given the title of this episode, it should be no surprise that this character is named Mithridates. But there are a lot of people named Mithridates in this episode. It was a family name, and some of his predecessors need to be introduced to set the stage. To make sure we keep everything straight, I'm going to be precise and only refer to each of them as, say, Mithridates III or Mithridates V. Once we get to our guy, Mithridates VI, we can dispense with this formality, but I don't want to inadvertently stumble into Aureliano in 100 Years of Solitude territory on our way to our main character. In the last few episodes, we've gone to new places, so to speak. In getting to know Ahsoka Moria and Wu of the Han, we dialed the historical clock all the way back to 0, more or less, and introduced not only those great leaders, but also covered an outline of the foundations of their great civilizations. Today, we're heading back to a part of the world we've been many times before. Geographically, we'll be in Asia Minor. Culturally, we are back in the Persian and Hellenic worlds. So we don't have to take the DeLorean back quite so far, but it might be helpful to set the stage a bit because this area hasn't exactly been peaceful since Alexander exited the scene a couple hundred years ago. In doing so, we'll have to be a bit selective about which details to cover because if we're not careful, we could get dragged into the chaotic vortex that followed old Alex's death. We will have to stay outside that particular event horizon. So here we go. As mentioned in the previous episodes, after Alexander died, the Macedonian Empire fell into a violent civil war with many of his inner circle and several other commanders besides fighting it out for control. These people, whom we call the Diadochi or successors, carved Alexander's empire into several lesser but still huge, wealthy, and independent kingdoms. While not the largest, the wealthiest of the successor kingdoms was Egypt. In the immediate aftermath of Alexander's death, his trusted general and childhood companion Ptolemy rushed to the ancient lands of Egypt and made his claim, establishing the Ptolemaic dynasty, which is recognized as the 33rd and final dynasty in Egypt's long dynastic history. Among other things, in order to cement his legitimacy, Ptolemy corpse-napped the body of Alexander as it was making its way back to Macedonia for a proper burial in the family's tomb. By possessing the earthly remains of the great conqueror, Ptolemy was creating a physical link between himself and the fallen king that everyone admired so much. Well, except for maybe or not the person that anonymously killed him, but you'll have to go back and listen to those episodes for that story. Ptolemy set Alexander up in a grand mausoleum, one that would have become a place of almost pilgrimage for aspiring conquerors and commanders. It has been lost over time, and the location of the mausoleum of Alexander is one of the great unsolved archaeological mysteries of all time, but then again, I don't think anyone ever asked Robert Stack. Ptolemy is an important and interesting figure. One, it's hard for me to avoid diving too deep into, but I will remain strong. Ptolemy is a bit overshadowed by one of his descendants, though. For in about 250 years, another member of the Ptolemaic dynasty will enter the collective consciousness as one of the most famous people of all time, Cleopatra. Yes, that Cleopatra, but we will get there down the road. One of the ironies, at least to me, is that some of the ambitious guys that tried to seize power were not high-ranking members of Alexander's inner circle. They were just driven for power and glory, and when the world fell into chaos, they saw their opportunity and they went for it. For a land/territorial standpoint, the clear winner that emerged from the civil wars was Seleucus. A level below the bigwigs at the outbreak of the Wars of Succession, Seleucus eventually came to rule roughly of what we think of as the Persian Empire, with borders stretching from India in the east and roughly halfway across Asia Minor in the west. It was this guy that tussled with Chandragupta a few episodes back, and some sources even have Seleucus marrying one of his daughters to the founder of the Mauryan Empire. Seleucus himself would ultimately be assassinated in 281 BCE by one of Ptolemy's sons, but he was successful in establishing a dynastic kingdom, and the Seleucid Empire was huge, wealthy, and prosperous. In the home turf of Macedonia and Greece, another lesser character asserted himself onto the scene. Cassander was the son of Antipater, the aged general that Alexander had left in charge back home when Alexander had launched his conquests. While Alexander was away fighting his wars of conquest and destruction, Antipater had all but ruled the home territory himself. When Alexander died, Cassander's father seized Macedonia and Greece to rule them as a sovereign in his own right. But he was careful enough to maintain the pretense of serving as a regent to Philip III and Alexander IV, respectively the half-brother and young son of the dead king. Just before Antipater died in 319 BCE, an event that was noteworthy for his death being natural, not violent, the aged regent looked at his own son and found him lacking. Antipater passed over Cassander for a more worthy candidate, Polyperchon, another aged officer who had served the royal family dating back to the rule of King Philip II. Everyone knows that he's my favorite. Furious that his ambitions had been thwarted upon the death of his father, the vicious Cassander raised a force and started a civil war. After 2 years of bloody fighting, Cassander overthrew Polyperchon and, for good measure, executed Alexander's mother and eventually his wife Roxana and his young son, and instead, in their place, established the Antipatrid dynasty. Cassander didn't have long to enjoy his ill-gotten gains. He died of dropsy in 297 BCE. He didn't miss much, just constant infighting, alliances, betrayals, and general chaos. He left no meaningful legacy behind, other than one of infamy by killing Alexander's wife and child, and his kingdom was eventually swallowed up by a son of one of the other Diadochi. There were other claimants to the various territories, and it's all fascinating stuff. The reason that we've talked just a little bit about this genuinely chaotic time is that it is important to establish a few things. 1. The post-Alexandrian world was bloody and vicious. 2. The Macedonian Empire shattered into smaller kingdoms, which were generally in a state of continuous warfare with one another. And 3. The borders were constantly shifting. New kingdoms rose and fell or were swallowed up and spit out by other ones along the way. The map was always changing. This created opportunities for ambitious people to try their hand at settling up their own kingdoms by carving out their own turf amid the roiling chaos. Back in those Alexander episodes, we spent a minute discussing the Susa weddings, when Alexander forced his generals and commanders to marry Persian noblewomen so that he could speed up the integration of Persian and Hellenic cultures. After Alexander died, all the surviving generals divorced their Persian wives. Well, except one, Seleucus. In this, Seleucus showed buy-in to Alexander's cultural integration program, and when he set up his own kingdom largely centered on Achaemenid Persia, Seleucus continued these policies. As such, Persian nobles could enjoy positions of prestige and rank within the Seleucid Empire. But Persians were not always trusted, nor were they immune from getting caught up in the petty power struggles of the Diadochi. Such was the fate of a Persian ruler of a small city called Cius, located in the northwest of modern Turkey at a strategic point on the Sea of Marmara, lying between the Hellespont, the modern Dardanelles, to the south and the Bosphorus Strait to the north. In the scheming between the Diadochi, one power-hungry Hellenic king, Antigonus I, engineered the assassination of the Persian ruler of Cius, Mithridates II. Upon his death, the family's domains went to his son, Mithridates III, but Antigonus had designs on killing the son as he had killed the father. An ally got wind to Mithridates III, and he quickly fled before the assassins could strike. Moving northwest, Mithridates III went to Paphlagonia on the Black Sea coast. If you look at a map of modern Turkey and look at the northern part of the country, you will see a hump in the top middle of Asia Minor as it borders the Black Sea. That's Paphlagonia, and that's where Mithridates III set up shop. The area was ostensibly part of the Seleucid Empire, but it was a bit of a backwater, out of the reach and mind of the Seleucids and Mithridates III exploited this local power vacuum to establish a new base of operations. To protect himself from Antigonus, who had killed his father and tried to kill him, and from Seleucus, who would surely try to get his territory back once he noticed that a rival was building a power base inside his own kingdom, Mithridates III seized a stronghold and prepared the defensive fortifications of his local fiefdom. Over time, he began to attract to his banner other disaffected leaders and soldiers. Mithridates III slowly emerged as a regional power player in his own right. He didn't get much relief from the ongoing internecine warfare. He had to fight off armies sent to curb his ascendancy. But he managed to do just that, and with each failed attempt to topple him, the king grew more powerful, and he attracted more followers. In the process, he quickly established himself as a powerful ruler in his own name. By 281 BCE, the same year that Seleucus went and got himself assassinated, Mithridates III felt secure enough in his territory to call himself King of Pontus, a new kingdom bubbling up amidst all the ongoing infighting of the Diadochi. It's at this point that he, confusingly, switches to being known not as Mithridates III of Cius, the ancestral home of his forebears, but as Mithridates I, founder of his own kingdom. In many ways, Pontus embodied the idealized hybridization between the Greek and Persian cultures that Alexander had envisioned. The territory had been previously incorporated into a Persian satrapy, yet had been governed by the Greco-Macedonians since Alexander's conquests. It was organized by a founding dynasty of Persian origin. In fact, the Mithridatic family may have even been descended from the lesser branch of the Achaemenids, claiming Darius the Great as an ancestor. If you don't remember who Darius is, go back and listen to his episodes because he's pretty great. Even the name is Persian. It means given by Mithra. Mithra was an ancient Persian god and a good choice for a namesake. One of Mithra's responsibilities in the cosmic order was to bestow divine favor on chosen leaders and to legitimize the rule of kings. He also looked after things like friendship, contracts, and the rising sun. He had a lot on his plate, yet the founding family of Pontus hailed from Cius, a Hellenic city much closer culturally and geographically to Athens than Persepolis. The founders of the dynasty personified the mingling of Greek and Persian worlds. In time, their descendants would intermarry with Hellenic nobility and develop a polyglot religion drawing on both Persian and Greek religious traditions. By drawing on both Greek and Persian, the kingdom of Pontus was not one or the other, but rather became something wholly distinct, a kingdom and a culture unto itself. From the moment it was founded, Pontus was deeply embroiled in the regional conflicts between the various successor kingdoms. But Mithridates I, known as Cistes, or founder, was not one to be cowed. He began expanding his own borders, pushing outward from the citadel around which his kingdom had been founded. He seized key ports on the coast, took control of rivers in the area, formed alliances with other regional powers, and even bested an army sent by the Ptolemies bent on his destruction. Through it all, he expanded his base of power. When he died, he turned the kingdom over to his son, Ariobarzanes. In addition to its growing military strength, Pontus quickly grew prosperous. The founders of the Mithridatic dynasty chose their spot well. Pontus was agriculturally and pastorally productive, with a mild climate and fertile river valleys. Given its location along the Black Sea coast, it was well poised to be a player in regional trade networks across the sea and beyond. Pontus quickly swallowed up neighboring cities, Hellenic ones, including Sinope, which it seized and made the Pontic capital in 183 BCE, a task accomplished by the Pontic king Pharnaces I. Around the same time, Greece became the official language of the kingdom. The mid-2nd century BCE was a time of dynamism, not only for Pontus but for the world around it. Several important changes were unfolding. First was the decline of the post-Alexandrian successor kingdoms. Notably, the Seleucid Empire fell into steep decline due to infighting and power struggles. Second was the rise of other kingdoms, including Bithynia to the west of Pontus, Pergamum to the southwest, and Cappadocia to the south. These kingdoms reshaped the map of Asia Minor, fighting several campaigns against one another, notably between 182 BCE and 179 BCE. Third, and most importantly, an ambitious and expansionist new power was emerging from the central Mediterranean: Rome. As Rome had grown in prominence, it increasingly butted up against other great power of the ancient world, Carthage. Beginning in 246 BCE, Rome and Carthage began fighting a series of three increasingly destructive wars that would end in Carthage's utter obliteration in 146 BCE. Well, not exactly, given that there was nothing left when the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus wiped Carthage off the map to end the war. The Third Punic War didn't officially end until February 5th, 1985, when the mayors of Rome and the modern city of Carthage signed an official peace treaty, finally and formally ending the war a mere 2,134 years after it had actually concluded. This makes the Third Punic War the longest official conflict in human history. Of course, a modern peace treaty to an ancient conflict was a bit performative and didn't reflect an ongoing actual conflict between Rome and Carthage. But what was real enough was the state of war between Rome and, well, just about everyone else during and after the Punic Wars. Because these conflicts involved the two main Mediterranean powers as belligerents, all sorts of other states and kingdoms got involved, willingly or unwillingly. One of these was Macedonia, which longed for its glory days and had conspired with Carthage to open a war with Rome on two fronts. This ended disastrously for Macedonia, and in 168 BCE, Roman armies obliterated a Macedonian army of 30,000 and completed a subjugation of the region that had been ongoing for more than a generation. This same year, 168 BCE, marks the end of Macedonian independence and the nail in the coffin of the empire that Philip II and Alexander had built, then used as a stepping stone to conquer the world. But as Macedonia fell under Roman hegemony, their independent-minded neighbors down in Greece began to get ideas about their own freedom. While the Romans cloaked themselves in florid language as the liberators of Greece, they were anything but. In the 20 years following the conquest of Macedonia, Roman legions crashed into Greece, wave after wave, an upstart empire on the rise versus a classical culture on the decline, at least militarily. In 146 BCE, the same year that Scipio Aemilianus annihilated Carthage, a Roman army sacked and razed the powerful Greek city-state of Corinth. While not all of Greece fell under Roman dominion all at once, it was clear that the ascendant Romans were the major power in the region, and their borders began inching ever closer to Asia Minor. By that fateful year of 146 BCE, the fifth Pontic ruler to bear the name of Mithridates, and the eighth overall, was on the throne. Like his predecessors, he lived at a time of geopolitical turbulence, complicated by the intermarriages with other dynastic families. Pontus had grown, but, checked by Bithynia on the west, the kingdom had moved east, up and around the Black Sea coast. Mithridates V was a pragmatic guy. He saw the rise of Rome and their increasing presence in the eastern Mediterranean. There was definitely a pattern to what happened to those that resisted Rome's advance. They were all crushed. Ironically, the Romans claimed to only fight defensive wars. Even as they attacked outward in all directions, they cloaked themselves in the righteous language of justice and self-preservation. This probably came as little consolation to those that fell ill of the Romans, but it helped the Romans sleep at night. Mithridates V saw Rome's increasing activity in the area and decided it could be used to his benefit. His predecessors had started positive diplomatic relations with Rome, but Mithridates V upped the ante a bit and provided some ships and troops to aid Rome during the Third Punic War. As this was happening, at the same time of Rome's control of Macedonia and conquest of Greece, Rome needed all the resources they could get, and the gesture by the Pontic king helped put him in Rome's good graces. Pontus was not the only Anatolian kingdom that had partnered with Rome. Pergamum was a wealthy, culturally Greek city-state on the Aegean. When Rome eventually fell into conflict with the Seleucid Empire, Pergamum threw their weight behind the Romans. After the inevitable Roman victory, Pergamum was rewarded with extensive territories, and the Pergamene kingdom sprawled out from the coast and across Anatolia. When its king, Attalus III, died childless in 133 BCE, he bequeathed his kingdom not to a relative or a successor, but to Rome. After some internal political strife back at Rome and a token effort at native rule, the Romans snuffed out all resistance and annexed the Pergamene kingdom, absorbing it into Rome's ballooning overseas holdings. In the fighting, Mithridates V had again aided Roman efforts, for which he was thanked and rewarded. But this conflict eliminated a buffer state between Rome and Pontus, and Rome inched ever closer. The Romans had been brutal in suppressing the rebellion against their possession of Pergamum. Toward the end of the campaign, the Roman commander faced the prospect of prolonged sieges of several Pergamene cities. Rather than grind out long and potentially costly siege operations, this commander ordered poison dumped into the water supplies of the cities to hasten their collapse. Once in control of the newly organized Roman province of Asia, the Romans were voracious, extracting heavy taxes and tribute from the territory they were supposed to be protecting and governing. Fleecing the provinces was a long-standing Roman tradition, but the exploitation of the province of Asia took it to new heights. To make sure that everyone understood who was in charge in the area, the Romans exacted revenge on any city that had supported native independence through even higher taxes and retribution on any local leaders that had dared defy Rome. So, while Pontus and Mithridates V appeared to have benefited from the regional chaos, it became apparent to him and to all local kingdoms that Rome's presence in Asia Minor did not portend good fortune. Mithridates V wasn't the only member of the Pontic royal family to witness Rome's rise with trepidation. While only 6 at the time of Rome's obliteration of Pergamum, the king's son, also named, you guessed it, Mithridates, learned from the horrors of the Roman campaign of suppression and annexation and poison. Thus, from an early age, he was imbued with a deep distrust of the savage Italians that seemed so bent on subduing the world to their will by any means available to them. Despite the dread that came with having Rome for a neighbor, the young prince passed an otherwise enjoyable childhood. He was a curious and active youth. He learned many languages. He collected rocks and gems. He rode horses and hunted and even designed his own clothes, defying the Hellenic styles in favor of Persian ones, in part to honor his own ancestry, but also in a deliberate attempt to emulate Alexander the Great, who took to wearing Persian clothing after his conquest of the Achaemenid Empire. But his big passion was poison. Fascinated with herbalism and toxicology, the prince conducted experiments, gathered information, read medical texts, and concocted his own compounds. If this sounds like a strange hobby for a young prince, it must be considered that he had 3 important influences that shaped his world and stoked his imagination. First, Pontus was the land of Medea, a mythical enchantress and diviner who kept the secrets of poisons and antidotes. Raised in the local mythology, Mithridates saw himself as hailing from the land that possessed these dark secrets. The second was that Deadliest III, the king of Pergamum that bequeathed his kingdom to Rome, took a keen interest in science and medicine. More interested in conducting experiments than governing, Attalus had built one of the world's first universal libraries. Among his lines of pursuit was an obsession with poisons and cures, and he conducted research and poured state resources into developing the body of knowledge. Mithridates would have heard rumors that Attalus had poisoned family members and courtly retainers as revenge for their mocking his scientific pursuits. He also tested compounds on prisoners. The third inspiration for the young Mithridates' obsession with poisons and antidotes was his own grandfather, Pontic King Pharnaces I. Allegedly, his grandfather had discovered a universal cure to all poisons, rendering him immune from all of them. Clearly bright, aside from his toxicological experimentation, he also received a more typical classical education, being raised like a Hellenic noble on the epics of the Iliad and Odyssey, and of course, steeped in the legends of Alexander. By virtue of his father's marriage to a Seleucid princess, the young Mithridates even claimed descent from the great conquering Macedonian. Lineage was important to the young prince's identity. To differentiate him from all the other Mithridates in the family tree, he is called Mithridates VI, Eupator, meaning of noble father. Just like Alexander, who is also the scion of a powerful father, in time, history would also come to call him Mithridates the Great, to differentiate him from all the other people of the same name. Unfortunately for the young prince, his life was about to mirror some of the darker aspects of Alexander's story arc. The Pontic kingdom was wealthy and thriving. Under the leadership of its rulers, from the founders through Mithridates V, the kings had stabilized, then extended the borders. Its economy, agriculture, pastoralism, military, international diplomacy, it all developed and strengthened in the 150 or so years since the kingdom's establishment under Mithridates I. But there were darker currents running under the surface. There was factionalism, infighting, and courtly intrigue at every turn. Complicated marriage alliances tied Pontic kings, queens, princes, and princesses to members of ascendant and crumbling kingdoms and empires. It was a complex time. To let off steam, the king liked to gather up his inner circle and party. The royal feasts were extravagant. Produce and livestock poured in from all across the kingdom and through its trade networks. Banquet halls were full of royal retainers and hangers-on. Every sumptuous food was on the table, fine wines in every cup. In 120 BCE, the king gathered his court for one such feast in the capital of Sinope. Everything was going great until the king gasped out, grabbed his throat, and promptly died. He had been poisoned. He was 71 or so years old, and he had ruled the Pontic kingdom for 3 eventful decades. He was a good ruler, navigating enormous local and international turmoil while enriching his kingdom and elevating its status in the international community. He was also a great patron of art, religion, and architecture, thus enriching the spiritual and temporal worlds of his kingdom. For all of his accomplishments, someone wanted and got him dead. The question was, who? Mithridates V died amidst revelry, as had Philip II. The poisoner was anonymous. No one knew who was responsible, but people had their suspicions. And just like Philip, eyes turned toward the queen as the culprit. Laodice VI was the wife of Mithridates V. In the complex world of royal marriages, the two were related. She was a princess of the Seleucids. In fact, the intermingling of these royal houses and the complicated world of their marriages make it almost impossible to say for certain exactly who she was, who her parents were, and what the kinship between her and Mithridates V was. She may have been, like so many royal women and girls of the time, used as a tool of political diplomacy in her marriage, but she was a strong and independent-minded character. She and Mithridates V had 7 children together. The oldest, whom we've already met, ascended to the throne as Mithridates VI. But there was a catch. The dead king's will stipulated that the rule be handed down not solely to his oldest son, but that the kingdom would be co-run by 3 chosen successors. The first was Mithridates VI. The second, his young brother, named, you guessed it, Mithridates, this one with the epithet of Crestus, meaning the good. The third was their mother, Laodice. Both boys were too young to rule on their own, and Laodice became the de facto ruler of Pontus. One son was comfortable letting mom run the show. The other increasingly understood his life was at risk. Mithridates Crestus was, by all accounts, a mild-mannered and pleasant young man, several years younger than his co-king and brother. He was also quite pliable, easy for Laodice to manipulate. Mithridates VI, on the other hand, was intelligent, strong-willed, and not so easily pushed around. He was also much closer to his majority, being around 15 at the time of his father's assassination and his own accession. Whoever killed Mithridates V was at large. It must have been someone close to the royal family, or within it, a guard, an advisor, or a mother. Mithridates VI began to get wind that maybe his mother wanted him out of the picture too. After all, if he were gone, then she could exercise unrestrained power through her milder younger son. Mithridates, and from here on out, we're only going to use that name for him, feared for his life. Just like Alexander, he began sleeping with a sword under his pillow and surrounding himself with bodyguards. Tensions in the palace rose. Suspicions ran high. Above all, it was fear of poisoning that consumed the young king. Poison had killed his father. The killer remained at large, likely someone very close. If they wanted Mithridates gone, then they would likely use the same method to dispatch him. The experiments in poisons and anecdotes he had conducted during his idyllic youth now took on an urgent tone of deadly seriousness. Frantically, Mithridates cast about for knowledge into the dark secrets of toxicology. inventorying various poisons and anecdotes. While he sought knowledge about the universe of poisons, one in particular became the subject of his obsession: arsenic. It was the most likely candidate responsible for the death of his father, which made it all the more likely that it would be used against him. He ingested a minuscule amount. When a bit of time had passed, he ingested a little more, and then a little more. Over time, he gradually built up his doses, inuring himself against the fatal poison. In time, he would grow immune to the notorious poison. Inconceivable. All the while, his mother's scheming nature fueled his sense of paranoia. Was she trying to kill him? He couldn't be sure. He spent more and more time away from the palace, building his physical stamina to match his pharmacological immunity. He hunted, exercised, and explored the surrounding territory. One day, with a group of companions by his side, he left the palace and did not return. Fearing for his life at the hands of his own mother, Mithridates went into a self-imposed exile. If his mother had indeed been planning his murder, then Mithridates would have to stay out of her reach. This ruled out a life of leisurely exile in a distant city, where his mother's network could reach him. But Mithridates was no dandy. He was an accomplished outdoorsman and hunter. He had been building his physical stamina for years, emulating the great heroes of the past, proving his prowess through his endurance of hardship and his skills in hunting. He and his loyal companions made a deliberate choice. They would not seek the comfort of a city, not even of a bed. Rather, Mithridates would stay out of the reach of his scheming mother by living off the land. They hunted and foraged for subsistence, relying on their abilities and strength to endure a life outdoors. For years, some sources say 4 years, others say 7, Mithridates and his companions stayed mobile, moving from place to place, never staying too long to exhaust local resources, and not allowing anyone tracking them to get a line on their location. Mountains, river deltas, valleys, Mithridates and his loyal band of companions roamed the wild countryside, disappearing from sight, a shadow, a myth. For her part, Laodice enjoyed running the show. With her compliant son only nominally on the throne and her more stubborn older son lost in the wilderness, she was essentially the sole ruler of the Pontic kingdom. More concerned with the trappings of rule than the exercise of good and just government, she wallowed in luxury. Her husband had courted the Romans, and she continued to do the same. She was all too eager to accept bribes from seedy Roman representatives. A decadent spendthrift, she subverted the kingdom's finances and plunged Pontus deep into debt. She also did nothing as Rome gobbled up more and more territory, creeping ever closer to the Pontic borders. She didn't seem to mind. Things were going well for her personally, but the same could not be said for her subjects. The kingdom needed help. Now, it must be said that there is a different interpretation of Queen Laodice. It's possible that she wasn't the grasping, wicked poisoner. When Mithridates V was killed, she faced the same dilemma as her eldest son. Namely, whoever had killed her husband was likely a member of the inner circle of the Pontic court, and still at large, still anonymous, and still potentially deadly. While her son fled into the wilderness, she stayed, and it's entirely possible that her life was on the line too. In this scenario, Laodice was at the whim of a group of conspirators, and she had to be pliable in doing what her senior advisors demanded, lest she end up in the same boat as her dead husband. Either way, things weren't going well for Pontus. Fortunately, there was that one guy, out in the wild, living the life of a nomadic hunter, waiting for the right moment to reclaim his throne. In 113 BCE, or thereabouts, Mithridates did just that. After years in the wild, he ended his exile and returned to the capital Sinope to lay claim to his birthright. The people poured out in wild exuberance to welcome home their king, the lost son of the accomplished and much-loved Mithridates V. But the Mithridates that returned was not the same boy that left all those years ago. Now in his early 20s, he had reached physical maturity. Tall, imposing, broad-shouldered, and strong, he was honed from his years in the wilderness. But he hadn't just matured physically. Already intelligent, his time in exile had made him cunning, resilient, and self-reliant. He had led his companions into and out of years of survivalist existence, never once taking to the comfort of sleeping in a bed or under a roof. Everything they'd needed to survive they had provided with their own hands. The Mithridates that returned to Pontus was confident, ready to assert himself and done being afraid of his mother or anonymous conspirators. Mithridates wasted no time in taking control. There was no power struggle, no civil war, or heavy factional infighting. He simply arrived and assumptively grabbed the reins of power. No one stood in his way. His moment had arrived. He clearly had no inner conflict over who was responsible for the death of his father. He had his mother seized and thrown in prison. For good measure, his younger brother was tossed in too. Neither of them lived long, both dying in captivity in short order. The sources suggest Laudis's quick death was from natural causes, although it's tantalizing to think that Mithridates quietly poisoned his mother as revenge for her having done the same to his father. Younger brother followed mom to the grave shortly thereafter. In an act of piety, real or performative, Mithridates interred his mother and brother in the family's rock-cut tombs. They were worth more to him dead than alive. These tombs, today a UNESCO World Heritage Site, are distinctly Achaemenid Persian in style. Now solely in charge, Mithridates, with his Persian style and flair, took over at the helm of his Greek-speaking kingdom. But as time would tell, the young king on the Pontic throne could only be described as distinctly his own man. Which seems like a good place for us to pause the story, with Mithridates about to embark on his reign, all obstacles removed, confident, strong, and ready to put his ambition to work. Thank you for listening to this episode. I am grateful that you did. Join us on the next one when we dive into the 50-year reign of Mithridates, not the first Pontic king to bear the name, but inarguably the greatest